Hi, welcome to another edition of Engineering with LEGO Bricks and Robolab. I'm Eric Wong, and I'll be your host. Okay, I'm going to start the little section of code here that I created for the jump tutorial. So this thing basically repeats forever, which is actually not necessarily. It is a bad thing to do in programming. So let's get rid of these jumps, and let's do something more in line with what we'd want to do. We want to capture our design intent. Control B to get rid of those bad wires. All right, let's do something which involves looping. So that's another structure. So I'll go ahead and push structures there and do loops. And now I can loop for various reasons. The most basic loop would be actually just a loop for a given number of times. So I'll come in here and do a little auto wiring, get that to auto wire, and get that to auto wire, and now I can go and I can loop for a number of times. So I'll go get my modifier here, tag that in there, and auto wired for me. And when you first put that down, it's kind of nice. It's already highlighted, so I can edit the tool edit there. So for example, 10 times. Now what this is a loop which will execute this loop 10 times. So it's a do while n is less than 10 as it counts down. So it'll loop 10 times. So turn the motor on, turn the motor off, turn the motor on. So we're about to lurch forward or turn or whatever it is 10 times in a row. And once it's done it 10 times, the program continues executing. In this case, it just ends. But if we had stuck something in here, the program would have continued to do whatever else. So it's a temporary loop. So let's loop a certain number of times. One of the common things that people do is something that might look like this. It looks kind of silly, but people do it a lot, so I see it happen all the time. This loop will execute 10 times. It'll execute in about 1/100th of a second, because it doesn't take much time. It takes a millisecond or so to turn a motor on. It takes a millisecond or so to turn a motor off. So this thing will loop about 10 times in about 1/100th of a second. So it goes really, really fast. So I see that happen all the time. You forget that looping will loop as fast as physically possible for the RCX to execute that code. So it'll loop as fast as physically possible. So just be aware of that. A couple undos, put those guys back. Okay. Now, usually we don't loop for a given number of times. Well, sometimes we do. A lot of times we want to loop for a given amount of time, or we want to loop while touch sensor is pressed. So I can go in here and replace this guy. I'll go and replace, get my loops, and you can't see it off the screen there, but there's my loops. I can loop, for example, while the touch sensor is pushed. Now, of course, that doesn't make much sense because I can't push it 10 times, so I'll delete that guy, delete the wires. And now I have a little piece of code here that says, do this loop while the touch sensor is pushed. So if the program comes along and the touch sensor is pushed, it'll enter here and do this as long as the touch sensor is pushed. And now it only checks for the touch sensor being pushed at the beginning. So if I had released it somewhere in here and then pressed it again, when it gets back to the loop, it just checks. The beginning here says, is the touch sensor pushed, yes or no? If it's currently pushed, go ahead and loop one more time. As soon as I let go, it doesn't stop executing the loop. You got to remember that it only checks that at the beginning of the loop. Okay, which will take 2 seconds. So this will check that touch sensor once every 2 seconds to decide whether it loops. And of course, if it isn't pushed, when it goes to check, it just skips everything here and continues on and does whatever we would stick in this part of the program. Okay, so that's one way to go ahead and do a loop. Another way, which is common, you can do that for light sensors, and rotation sensors, and greater than containers, and those type of things. Another common way to do is looping for a given amount of time. Let me remove that bad wire. So in this case, this is a looping while the timer is less than a certain value. So we need to have a value to attach it to. So I'm going to go ahead and use my space bar here, and I can say 1/10 of a second, create a constant for myself, and the default is 50. Oops, default is 50. And so this is basically saying while the timer is less than 50, now it's in 1/10 of a second, you probably saw it there while I had the wire tool over it, compared to 1/10 of a second. So while the timer is less than 50/10 of a second, so it's 5 seconds, do this loop. Well, what timer? In this case, we need to have a particular timer, so let's go in here, function palette here, and actually going to use a reset tool here, which allows me a timer. Now, the biggest mistake people make is they grab the container, because these two are right next to each other, and they look fairly similar, so make sure you get the right one. And you get a timer in here, auto wiring, and the timer basically, when Robolab sees this icon, it basically starts the stopwatch. So until this icon is reached, the stopwatch hasn't started ticking away. So there's really nothing to compare against. So this doesn't have to appear at the beginning of the program. This particular one it does. So I could say, okay, now start the stopwatch. Is the stopwatch less than 5 seconds? Yes. Loop. So it keeps going through here, and of course it'll loop. Since this loop takes about 2 seconds, it should loop about 3 times roughly before it stops executing. And so that's a typical way you do things. So if you want to have to do something for 5 seconds or do something for 6 seconds or whatever, we use a timer in a loop. Now there are 3 different timers. The default is to use the red, but if you want to actually go in and use other timers, there are actually the red, blue, and yellow timers in there. So you can use different timers. There's nothing to say that I couldn't use a container here also. I can use this as a variable, so I can come in here and say, while this is less than the number of times the touch sensor has been pushed, and that will be covered later in some other tutorials. But that's fairly typical. So looping for a given number of loops, looping for a condition like loop while the touch sensor is pressed, while the light sensor is greater than 50, or loop for a given amount of time. And that's basically how you do loops.